the more that I'm just okay with it, the more I'm not arguing with it, there's a flow that can emerge. Sure, it might not look how I want it to look, but there's still a flow that I'm tapped into. And this flow is so deeply tied to a letting go of outcome that is just a great allowing for things to be what they are. And of course, this ties in with one's capacity to see the truth of their own nature. Sometimes the best way to do this is to just talk about my direct experience. And then as I dive into that, you can sort of see where it applies to your own life. And as it relates to deep spiritual insight and creating an awesome life, I could just go to the moment at hand and look at what my experience is and see all of the different lives I could be creating in this moment. I could be creating pissed off life, given the circumstance. I could be creating a sad life. I could be creating a funny life, all wrapped around the same circumstance. And so let me share a little bit about my direct experience, and then we will interweave that with some profound spiritual insights and see if that exposes anything that's relevant for you. So here I am doing a live video. I almost canceled it because I'm not feeling well. I have super, super low energy. I was in bed most of the day yesterday, and I'm processing a flavor of detox. So I'm not necessarily surprised by this. It's just part of a process. And then in combination with that, right outside this ear, I have a bunch of dogs barking. And then out on this side is some sort of construction project. So you can see the situation. Right, like here I am trying to work and I don't feel well. And there's noise all around. And this sets up the potential to have a life that might be less than ideal, or a circumstance that's less than ideal. And one of the insights that I often point to, and we don't even have to say this is spiritual, but to me, everything is spiritual in nature. So, but that insight being that my internal world, my emotional state of being is never responding to what's happening out there. It's never responding to circumstance. It's always and only responding to my perception. It's responding to how I see circumstance. And so if I show up here and I have a particular outcome in mind, an expectation, such as I'm going to show up here and I'm going to feel awesome. It's going to be super quiet. I'm going to be able to focus, be able to stay on point, and I'm going to deliver something of value that looks and sounds how I hope it will sound. Now, if I have that sort of expectation, which we might also call a demand, as I encounter which appears to be the opposite of it, then you can see how that conflict will create an interpretation that is saying something is going wrong. Furthermore, the more I'm attached to the outcome, the more of a problem it'll be. And this is maybe another deep spiritual insight. To be attached to outcome is essentially saying that my worth and value is determined by the end result. Meaning we have this future projection, and case in point, this experience where I might have an idea of how this should go. The attachment to that outcome says if it ends up how I think it should be, then it means that I'm worthy. It means that I'm good enough. Now you can see if you get the opposite, then it means I'm the opposite. Which is so interesting because in our search for wholeness, in our search for being complete, there's so many potential interruptions to that quest, to that place we're trying to get to. And of course, those interruptions become annoyances, become enemies, so to speak, that are in our way as we endeavor toward some version of ourselves that we think is enough. And this is really at the core of all of our flavors of suffering. And it's also at the core of the human experience. And granted, it takes a degree of self-honesty to really see this, that within the human experience, there is a confusion which is on a quest trying to find wholeness in the future. And maybe a way to look at this, at the risk of constantly repeating myself, everyone's got the same damn problem. And that is that sense of inadequacy, the feeling that I'm not enough, the feeling that I'm missing something, the feeling that I'm not loved. These are all just different ways of saying the same thing. And in the belief in that inadequacy, it energizes a quest that tries to fix it. But of course, it tries to fix it in the world. It creates an image of how things need to be for you to be enough. And so we say, if only this, if only that, if only I were to be able to show up here and not feel terrible, if only I were to show up here and not be distracted by all the noise, then that would give me a greater chance of solving the one problem. And you see this attachment to outcome. And again, looking at my direct experience now, or looking at my whole past journey, it's so obvious that this is the source of the anxiety, that somehow circumstance is going to interrupt my search for wholeness. And of course, looking at these things, you just see how impossible it is. And I guess the more you understand that this is going on, it becomes more and more obvious that that search can never be fulfilled in the world. Like, no matter how much you rearrange the surface, if anything, it can temporarily give you an illusion of completeness. A great example of this is in relationships. It's like the person who has that inadequacy and says, oh man, if only I could find someone who loves me, then I would know that I'm lovable. Then I would know that I'm enough. And then they finally find someone where in appearances, it looks like they love them and it looks like they've captured them, right? This person has committed to them. But it doesn't take long before we have to encounter the real unknown about it all. And then you start realizing, wait, what about tomorrow? Are they going to be here tomorrow? And so we go back into this fear loop that fears losing the thing that we think we found, the thing that presents a solution to the problem that we had. And we don't want to lose that solution, which is so interesting because the thing that you got that you said would solve the problem, you now fear losing it, which puts you right back in the same problem. And so no matter what it is we are chasing in life to solve this problem of inadequacy, the more you think the solution to the problem is the thing outside, then even if it seems like you get the thing outside, you will become afraid of losing the thing, which makes it very difficult to just enjoy where you are. And so in my experience, in this work that I do, if I were on a quest to find my worth and value in a particular image of my work, then I would be really bothered by not being able to show up here with you in a particular way that I want to and with a particular environment. But in seeing that the whole quest is silly, presents an invitation to just show up and let be what is. Meaning, if I show up and the dogs are barking, then that's what's happening today. If there's construction going on, then that's what's happening today. And you know what's interesting about this? Is the more that I'm just okay with it, the more I'm not arguing with it, there's a flow that can emerge. Sure, it might not look how I want it to look, but there's still a flow that I'm tapped into. And this flow is so deeply tied to a letting go of outcome that is just a great allowing for things to be what they are. And of course, this ties in with one's capacity to see the truth of their own nature. Because again, like I said, the dynamic of suffering for human beings is deeply tied to a sense of identity. But if your identity is wrapped up in the world, which is future outcome, which is the mind's content, then it's eternally going to feel insecure. But the more you see the nature of what you really are and that it's not touched by all this mental noise, then it becomes that much more difficult to be disturbed by what's going on in the world. And so as I'm here with you now engaging this is the exercise in the practice that I am invited to engage in. It's what I'm reminded of, especially as I take that minute before I start and just be still. It's like a great release of outcome. Like, oh yeah, this doesn't need to end up a certain way. This doesn't need to reach a particular destination. I can just be here. And that's okay. That's enough. Because you see that's enough. And if it's not looking how my mind wants it to be, and there's the attachment to outcome, then the mind says, no, this isn't enough. But again, beyond all that noise, it just is what it is. And if there's anything that you are struggling with regard to circumstance, whether that be a relationship breakup, whether that be a loss of a job, whether that be something just not going how you thought it was going to go, my invitation for you is to get deeply honest about the real issue. Because that's where the liberation is always going to be found. Is what is the real issue? What is this really about? This pain that I'm feeling. Because, and again, this is so fascinating and it's deep spiritual insight. There's a beautiful layer to this where on the surface, there's what you're blaming. And I don't say that in a negative way, just as looking at the mechanism. You have an internal emotional disturbance. And then the mind says, I'm feeling this because of XYZ on the surface. But that's not really why you're feeling that. We're feeling how we're feeling because of the stories that we're telling. And if you're feeling shitty, you're telling a shitty story about yourself. That shitty feeling is almost like a form of violence. It feels kind of violent. But that feeling is simply reflecting what is being thought. And if you look at the story you're telling about your circumstance, in some way, it's saying that this means I'm not enough. This means I'm not lovable. Do you see that that's a violent way of seeing yourself? Just like if I was here doing this session and I'm arguing with everything that's happening, proclaiming it shouldn't be, proclaiming that it's in my way of becoming whole and complete, that is another way of saying, because this is happening, it means I'm not enough. And so, yeah, that would feel shitty. Isn't that wild? what is happening on the surface. In one way, it's profound to say that what's happening on the surface doesn't require any emotionality to it, meaning it's neutral. And so often, even what we think is happening on the surface is just a story about what's happening on the surface. So the invitation is to see what's happening beyond any story. Like, for example, in a relationship breakup, someone could say, that person left me. And we could say that's an objective way of describing what happened. Well, I don't know, because to say that they left you is to make it about you rather than somebody was here and then they went here. Something shifted, something moved. But to make it personal, that's a story. That's to turn it into something. That's to make it about you. Or to say that, okay, I lost my job. Okay, well, lost is a particular story. I mean, there's so much that we can dive into that. But to see these things beyond any interpretation, which is a creation of a reality. Like, don't turn it into anything. What is it really? And there's such a stillness that is invited here, which relaxes all the projections and comes back to reality. And this is what helps me see things more clearly, is to get out of my own way, because so often these projections are what we want to turn it into. And this can be so subconscious where you're turning it into something, but you don't realize that you're the one that's turning it into something. You really think that what you see is actually happening. It's like being rejected. And this is one of those wild and obvious examples where in reality, it's impossible to be rejected. That's always just a story. Even if somebody says, I reject you, you're the one that has to give that authority. You're the one that has to give it a meaning. You're the one that has to take it personally. And so this whole spiritual endeavor, my goodness, is really an invitation to see things more clearly, which is quite fascinating, because I guess in the beginning, when one enters spirituality, like everything else, we turn it into something that it's not. Maybe we get a little lost in the woo-woo of it all. But for me, it's so profoundly practical and simple to be still and know, which is to be still and discern the difference between what I imagine to be happening and what's really happening, because it's always my imagination about what's happening that is causing the internal dis-ease. Which is really fascinating, because whatever spiritual tradition, whatever pathway, whatever religious context, at its core, it's saying this in some way. It's inviting us to be still and see what's true. And it's so interesting how these things can become so not practical. Like they get lost in some sort of mystical idea, which again, it's all play and it's fine. But it's an interesting phenomenon to have it circle around and come back to this radical practicality. And part of that radical practicality is realizing that I am creating every ounce of suffering that I'm experiencing. And not as a story of blame, to blame myself, but as an invitation to stop. And I guess the more you see the mechanism of this, the more you see how it works, it's less offensive and more helpful. Because the more you see deeply that there's nothing in the world, there's no other person that has the power over me to affect my internal state of being, then the invitation that reminds me that I'm creating all of my suffering is very helpful. and to see that the creation of my own suffering only happens when I'm not seeing things clearly is an invitation for me to be still and see things more clearly. And maybe something that's worthwhile to mention in this time that I'm at with not feeling very well and being in bed all day yesterday, I noticed that it's a little bit more difficult. It's a little bit more difficult to be available to see these things. Like I'm more irritable. It's easier to push my buttons. And maybe a great example of this is, so I got sick yesterday and my girlfriend came back from a weekend. She went off to a wedding and she came back and was excited to see me. And here I am, right? Like I'm sick. And in her mind, she's probably envisioning this great welcome home. I missed you too, yada, yada, yada. And I'm just not interested at all. At all. Like there's no sweetness in me at all. I'm just laying in bed, half unconscious. Also feeling a little bit irritated with her enthusiasm that's wanting my attention. And so I just had to, communicate the situation. Like, I appreciate, so much that you're being sweet and I understand you want my attention and yada, yada, yada. But here's how I'm feeling right now. So I'm sorry, but I am just not available. And again, there's such beauty in our capacity to communicate and let people know what's going on inside of us. Because I could imagine if I didn't just say anything at all, then I would even seem like a bigger dick. So communication is helpful. So yeah, that surprisingly flowed. Isn't that interesting? Because like I mentioned in the beginning, it was really uncertain with all the distractions. And even though I still hear those distractions going on, even though I still don't feel very well, I was able to show up here and flow and say something that might have been of value. So thank you for hanging out with me today.